Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. It's December the 2nd, 2022, and last night we had a level 3 grid alert in Alberta. It was extremely cold all across the province. Environment Canada issued extreme cold warnings to temperatures like -30, wind chill to -40, and of course, there's hardly any wind. And so we have more than 3,000 megawatts of wind on the grid now. But if there's no wind, it doesn't help at all. So the remaining coal plants, were just pumping out at top capacity, and natural gas was nearing its top capacity. There was no solar because the sun had already gone down. And so now we're in a situation in Alberta where we're starting to look a bit like what's happening in Europe, where we're rather dependent on our neighbors who are very helpful. But like last night, for instance, for a certain period of time, there was no power coming from Saskatchewan. We normally import a fair amount from Saskatchewan. There was nothing. So maybe they were also trying to deal with their own cold crisis. So I was looking at one of the government websites, and it looks like the plan is to install 10 times the amount of wind that we presently have in Alberta. And this all dates back to the notion of Dr. Danny Harvey's national power grid. This idea has captured the minds of all the climate ideologues. They think it would be fantastic to just string a little power line all across Canada, connect all the provinces, and voila! If we had lots of wind in Alberta, we could ship it to Ontario. And if we had lots of nuclear in Ontario and nothing in Quebec, we could ship it to Quebec. And it's just a ridiculous plan, ludicrously expensive, and potentially could put the whole country at risk of national blackout. So we don't want to go there. We've got a couple of commentaries that explain this. One is in French and English, and the other one is just in English. But it'll give you an idea of the exorbitant costs that the power would be, and the intricacies, the challenges that it would face. So, I think it's time that we take a step back. There's a new report that we put out, and it's called The Pursuit of the Impossible. And Robert Lyman has summarized a very complex report by a fellow named Simon Michaud. And Simon did this survey for the Geological Survey of Finland, where he simply extrapolated the needs of the energy transition to go net zero worldwide from the present use of critical minerals. And he found that it would take decades, sometimes hundreds of years, to be able to mine sufficient minerals for net zero, for all these fancy electrification plans, for all the decarbonization plans. And you'd have to build thousands and thousands of power plants. Now, so it is the pursuit of the impossible. And yet we're still rushing down that track toward this net zero goal. And people like Catherine McKenna want to make all these net zero goals and targets for corporations mandatory reporting. She also wants in her Integrity Matters report to impose on suppliers that they must support climate action. And again, making something mandatory when you can't even provide sufficient materials to make it happen is totally absurd. None of these people have done any of the necessary due diligence, and yet they're imposing these regulations on all of us, on industry, and on the little people. And you might say, well, why doesn't industry speak up? Well, when we interviewed Donna Laframboise, and she did her presentation on how climate activism is taking away everyone's freedoms, someone asked that question. And she said that she knows someone who works in corporate public relations. And basically the idea is that, the government has way more power and money than a corporation does, even a big corporation. So, it's the old, why fight City Hall when you won't win? So that's why corporations are not standing up. And, the little people like us Most of us don't even know this is happening. Like most people don't know how the power grid works. So that's one of the things that we try to do in our many reports that we put together. Our professional engineering team works on them. They're people who have experience in the actual workings of the power grid. And so we've tried to make them plain language enough that people can understand what we're up against. So I'm freezing to death. I'm going to go back inside where it's warm. Thanks very much to the providers of natural gas in Alberta and to the Alberta Electric System Operator that kept us from going to black last night in that grid alert. We have to stop this madness. We have to stop this climate tyranny. Whatever we can do to stop it, it's lawful. Let's do it. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.